the many photographers who worked with the Beatles and the individual Beatles over the years. Of all the photographers who ever worked with John in his solo years, there is nobody who captured John's image better, who took more iconic photographs of John, and who actually became a close friend of John than the man I'm going to introduce. The photographs you've seen over the years literally are the ones that are most representative. They reflect John the way he was in New York in the 70s. His book, John Lennon, The New York Years, is one of the most really acclaimed books of its kind. Please welcome my friend, Bob Gruen.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm Bob Gruen. I'm glad to be out here today, and I'm going to be showing you a couple of slides. They don't have it set up so that I can show the slides from here, so I'm going to be talking from the middle of the room there, and I'll come back after and answer some questions.
Terrific. Okay, Bob is coming amongst us. Lo, behold, make way. Bob is coming through.
Hello. Hello. There we go. Hi again. Let me just start this up so I know where I'll be. Hi. Like I said, I'm Bob Gruen. I'm a photographer from New York City. I learned photography from my mother, and it was my hobby all my life. And in the 60s, I lived with some rock and roll bands, and started taking pictures of them. And when they got signed, I met the record company, and I started working for different rock and roll bands. And I was included in a book in early 1971, 72, called Rock Photography. But I first saw John and Yoko in 1971. I went to the Apollo Theater. There was a benefit for the families of the prisoners who were hurt in a riot at Attica Prison. And Aretha Franklin was going to play, and I was excited about that, and I went up to see it. And as I walked in down the aisle, the announcer said, "Ladies and gentlemen, John Lennon and Yoko Ono and the Plastic Ono Band." And I was really excited. I knew they lived in New York. I had moved to New York, and in fact, I heard they lived around the corner from me in Greenwich Village. But I didn't know I was going to run into them. And backstage, they were standing around waiting for their car, and a lot of people were taking snapshots of them. And so I took a few pictures, at which point John said something like, "All these people who always take our pictures and we never get to see them, you know, whatever happens to them?" And I said, "Well, I live around the corner from you. I could show you my pictures." And he said, "Well, you live around the corner, then slip them under the door." And a few days later, I went by and I actually knocked on the door, and Jerry Rubin answered the door. And I said, "I have these pictures for John and Yoko," and he asked if they were expecting me, and I said, "No, I wasn't. I just left it there for them." And a few months later, because of the book that I was in, rock photography, the writer, Henry Edwards, who had done the biographies, asked me if I would come and photograph John and Yoko. He was writing a story about the Elephants Memory Band, and John and Yoko were using them in the studio as a backing band. And they were doing the interviews in a hotel on 57th Street, and I went up there to meet him, 59th Street, I think. And when I got there, Henry said that John and Yoko had just woken up and they were a little cranky. They didn't expect a photographer, but that I should just wait, and they'd wake up and they'd feel better, and they'd let me come up and I'd take pictures, and they'd probably like my pictures, and they'd probably like me, and I would probably do album covers for them and know them for a long time. And he said, "That's the way they are." And I said, "Well, all right, I'll be in the bar. Let me know when they're ready." And it actually happened just like that. A little while later, they said I could come upstairs. And I remember walking down the hall and feeling like really nervous. I was shaking. I was actually going to meet John and Yoko. And I knew it wouldn't work if I was shaking. And so I just stopped in the hallway. I took a deep breath. I realized the only way it would work is if I just went in as myself and did the best I could. And that's what I did, and things worked out really well. I took this picture that night. And because the story was about the elephant's memory, I asked if I could come along to the studio where they were recording with them and try and get some pictures of them together. And so I spent the night at the Record Plant studio taking pictures of them recording. And then towards the end of the evening, I reminded them that they had said they would pose for a picture, and I took this one. And I didn't think that John and Yoko would need my pictures. They were John and Yoko. And I went off on the road. I was working with Ike and Tina Turner at the time. And when I came back a few weeks later, I ran into Rick Frank, and he said that they'd been looking for me. They wanted to use this picture in their album cover for the Sometime in New York City package. And he took me over to John and Yoko's house on Bank Street, which was literally a half a block away from my house. And it was the first time I really sat down. We spent the afternoon sitting around talking and smoking and having a good time. And at the end of the day, Yoko said they really liked my pictures and they wanted me to come by the studio and hang out and feel free to take more pictures. And so I did, and a lot of interesting people started coming to the studio. I met Andy Warhol there. One night, Geraldo Rivera came by with Rob Nureyev. Also Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman were hanging around a lot. There was a lot of radicals who wanted John to help lead a movement against the Nixon administration. Although John wasn't really, didn't really feel it was his role to be actively involved in American politics since he was English, but he did always encourage people to vote, and he did always encourage people to be in favor of peace. With Geraldo, they made plans for a big concert at Madison Square Garden to benefit the Willowbrook School for retarded children. And so that summer, they started rehearsing for the concerts. And every time they rehearsed, there was a studio right nearby John and Yoko's house, about 4 blocks away, called Butterfly Studio. And we would go down there, and every night they would start to play a whole bunch of old 50s songs by Elvis Presley, Bo Diddley, Chuck Berry, and warm up. And then they'd start singing the set they were planning, and they included some of John's songs from the Beatles, Cold Turkey and Come Together. And that was really chilling, because I had known him about 3 or 4 months by this time, but it was like meeting this nice guy, John Lennon. He was playing with the Elephant's Memory, but when he started singing the Beatles songs, it was that voice and those songs, and we suddenly realized, like, it wasn't just our friend John in New York, this was a Beatle, and that was really exciting. And the rehearsals moved to the Fillmore East Theater, which was empty at the time. It had already closed, but they rented the theater to use as a larger area to rehearse in, and more people started showing up. David Peel was there with a whole bunch of friends for they were a backup choir called the David Peel and the Lower East Side. Film crew started filming everybody at work, and they started making plans to record the concert. But as the chaos grew around them, John and Yoko were always very centered and very close, and mentally, and as you can see from the picture, very physically in touch with each all the time, and kind of a grounded center in the middle of the storm. And then came the night of the big concert at Madison Square Garden. Everybody had new clothes made up, and very excited. We posed a picture in the dressing room before they went on, and Phil Spector, notoriously shy of photographers, was in a good mood and actually posed in the picture. It actually turned out we were all pretty drunk. People were drinking a lot. But Phil outdid us all and almost got thrown out that day. And it was only the 2 of the Sha Na Na members managed to actually fight with the guards and keep the guards from throwing Phil out long enough so Phil could run and lock himself back in the recording van and save that day. The concert was great. The opening acts were Roberta Flack, Sha Na Na, and Stevie Wonder. The crowd loved John. It was actually the only time I saw him do a live advertised show. It was absolutely fantastic. It was just a thrill to see him actually singing his songs and the audience singing along. And they'd given out tambourines to everybody, and they were all playing along and throwing the tambourines through the air. And people really liked John. They didn't really seem to like Yoko's part. John liked Yoko and had encouraged her to be part of the show. And it was a John and Yoko show, and John was singing his new political songs from the Sometime in New York City album, which didn't go over as well as the Beatle favorites. And when Yoko sang her songs like Sisters Are Sisters or Open Your Box, people were really booing, which John didn't appreciate. And it was the first time I had seen Yoko perform, and it was pretty intense. An interesting side note was that John and Yoko's assistant, Sarah Siegel, who had been working for him for a while, met my wife at the time, Nadia, backstage, and later they started to get along, and later, a few weeks later, Sarah hired Nadia to be her assistant. And then after having had all the pressure of working for John and Yoko for a while, Sarah quit, and Nadia was their personal assistant, which helped me to stay in touch with them. I think one of the high points of my entire career of taking pictures at concerts was standing next to John and Yoko when John was singing Imagine on stage at Madison Square Garden. It was an amazingly spiritual moment. Anyway, we all had a blast. We had a great time just rocking and rolling. The critics thought, however, that it was a little too sloppy, a little too raunchy. As an example of part of what was going on. As I said, every night when they warmed up, they would play a Chuck Berry or an Elvis Presley or Bo Diddley song. At the end of the concert, the crowd was cheering so much, John decided to give them one more encore, and he turned around to the band and he called out Hound Dog, the Elvis Presley song, which the band just went rocking right into and did a great version of, even though they had never played that song in any of the rehearsals. It just wasn't one of the ones they had picked, and they just were kind of winging it live. Anyway, they went back into the studio. Like I said, the concert wasn't well reviewed, and the plans for more concerts were kind of canceled at that point. John and Yoko went in and started recording an album for Yoko called Approximate Infinite Universe. A lot of people were still coming by. One night, I remember I had gone home around 3 in the morning, and just as I got home, the road manager called me and said, "You should come back because Mick Jagger's coming to the studio tonight." So I went back, and sure enough, he showed up. And John and Mick were really glad to see each other, very happy, like obviously old friends, and everybody in a good mood. And for a while, John and Tex Gabriel from the Elephant's Memory were showing Mick some of the new guitar leads that they were working out for their album. And during that time, Yoko wrote a new song, and then John and Yoko and Mick sat down on the piano and started playing the new song. And as you can see, they were all having a good time together. Now, this was in the fall of '72, and as I said, the campaign for Richard Nixon was going on. The night that Nixon was elected, everybody was pretty upset. Jerry Rubin was having a big party down at his house, but John and Yoko went to the studio first. We refer to those sessions as the tequila sessions because 8 people would drink about 12 bottles of tequila. And then we go out to drink after the session. And on that night, we went down to Jerry's house, and I remember in the car, John was so angry about the election, he was cursing like a Liverpool sailor. I've never heard such curses before or since. And down at Jerry's house, he got a little carried away. There was a girl that was coming on to him in a second room, and most of the people were in the main room where Yoko was. And then the sounds of some lovemaking were coming out of the other room, and it was really very embarrassing, particularly, with Yoko there. I left early because it was so embarrassing. The next day, John showed up and was obviously very contrite. We worked in the studio that night and then went out to the Pink Teacup for a breakfast, and John was asking forgiveness and trying to, make up for what he had done. But it was obviously he had gone a bit too far, and Yoko was kind of upset with him. And we went out after having breakfast, went out on the dock down at the end of Bank Street and took a walk out in the morning sun. One of the pictures that I took that morning ended up actually on the back of the album cover for Approximate Infinite Universe. And a few months later, John and Yoko were looking for a new place to live. The place that they had in the village was a very nice apartment in the bottom of a brownstone with a door that actually opened right out onto the sidewalk. And as people started finding out that they lived there, it was getting kind of crowded and all kinds of people would show up. I remember being there one time when somebody was at the door and the assistant came in and John said, "Well, who is it?" And the assistant said, "It's Jesus from Toronto." So it was time for them to move, and they started looking for another place. They were actually looking at some houses around New York. I drove them up to Greenwich, Connecticut, to Nadia's mother's house, my mother-in-law's house up there. And when we first got there, they took a walk in the backyard. The Lubins had a little boat there on a little lake, and John took Yoko for a little ride around the lake. As you can see, John was having a good time. Yoko's not so sure. But it was a really nice afternoon to go for a walk in the countryside, and I like this picture a lot because it kind of shows what it was like to be with John and Yoko. That's Nadia, my ex-wife, who was in the picture, and John would say something very funny, and then Yoko would answer with a very cynical kind of funny comment, and everybody would laugh a lot. A lot of people think Yoko doesn't have a sense of humor because she's very serious on the news usually. But you couldn't live with John Lennon without having a sense of humor, and Yoko has a very funny side to her, which comes out in her art, but most people don't get to see her art. Anyway, like I said, we had a really nice day in the country, although they didn't find the right house up there. And on the way home, I remember we stopped at an IHOP and just got coffee and pancakes, you know, like normal people do when you're on a road trip. Although, if you're with John and Yoko, the entire kitchen staff comes out and asks for an autograph, and we all got free IHOP cups to take home, which I still have. Then a few weeks later, they went uptown to look at the apartment in the Dakota, and I went along with them for the ride. And before they went in to look at it, we took a walk around Central Park to kind of warm up to the neighborhood a little, and we were taking some pictures there. This session that I did is one of John and Yoko's favorites. Particularly, there's a series of pictures I took of them around a tree, and they're passing a flower around the tree at some points. I think on one of the albums, Yoko actually cropped out their two hands touching, which is in one of the CD packages nowadays. On April 1st of '73, John and Yoko held a press conference because the Nixon administration had ordered John and Yoko deported, and a few months earlier. And as a response to that, John and Yoko held a press conference, and they announced the birth of a conceptual country, Newtopia. And they said that citizenship in the country can be obtained by declaration of your awareness of Newtopia. Newtopia has no land, no boundaries, no passports, only people. Newtopia has no laws other than cosmic. All people of Newtopia are ambassadors of the country, and as two ambassadors of Newtopia, we ask for diplomatic immunity and recognition in the United Nations of our country and its people. As you can see, their lawyer was kind of shocked. He had no idea that they were going to do this. They weren't actually granted diplomatic immunity immediately, and it took a lot of detective work to actually get to the bottom of the story that the Nixon White House had sent a memo to their Attorney General, John Mitchell, to try to deport John because his activities for peace had made them afraid, and they were afraid that he was going to be a leader in the upcoming convention against the Republican Party. I saw a great line where somebody said that John Lennon was attacked because he said, all you need is love, and give peace a chance in the middle of a war. Anyway, John's pressures were building at that time. The album wasn't selling very well. People didn't really like the political songs. Alan Klein, who had been managing the Beatles, and the Beatles decided to separate and split their separate ways. And there was a lot of subpoenas going back and forth. All their money was being held in escrow, and it was a very difficult time for him. John was drinking quite a lot, and Yoko wasn't. Yoko just wanted to get back to work. And so John went out to LA for a while and started recording with Harry Nilsson. Keith Moon was around, and Phil Spector was producing those sessions. I stayed in New York. I started working with other bands, New York Dolls, Alice Cooper, Kiss, and I was really kind of busy myself. So I missed most of the LA part, and maybe I'm healthier today because of that. Yoko put together a band, and she recorded another album that she produced herself called Feeling the Space. She played a week at Kenny's Castaways, and then in the summer of '74, she took the band to Japan and called me and asked me if I wanted to come along. It was my first trip to Japan, a great trip. When you travel with Yoko Ono, you meet some of the best people around, and I did, and I still have relationships with a lot of people in Japan today. And right after I came back to New York, John was back in New York that summer. Harry Nilsson had come with him, and John was producing an album called Pussycats, which Harry had written. And John asked me to come by and take some pictures of him. It was, like I say, a little past the LA period. They weren't nearly as wild and crazy. It was a lot quieter time. And then John asked me to come by his apartment and take some pictures for the upcoming album that he was recording called Walls and Bridges. And the art director had an idea where I would take a whole series of pictures just straight on of John's face while he's making a lot of different expressions. And then they would cut those pictures into slices, and there would be flaps on the album that would fold around to the back. So you could change the picture with the different flaps and make different expressions. And it was very much a kind of toy that you could play with. And rather than just one expression, John had all these different expressions. And the art director actually wanted Richard Avedon to do it, and John didn't want to be bothered going to a studio and dealing with stylists and publicists, and asked if I could do something a lot simpler since it was just going to be pictures of his face. And I went over to the apartment he was staying in on East 52nd Street and put some paper up on the wall. He had a rooftop there, a kind of patio. I put some paper up on the wall in the patio. We just took some pictures out there in the daylight. And then after we'd done the actual portrait pictures for the headshot, John asked if we should take some other pictures, then we'd have more pictures ready for the publicity kit. And I had given him a T-shirt that said New York City. It was a T-shirt that I used to wear all the time. I traveled around the world and was very proud of being from New York. And I'd given one to John a year earlier before he'd gone to LA, and I was very surprised that he knew exactly where it was when I asked him about it, and he went and put it on. And so up there on the roof, just took a series of pictures of him, and never expecting that this photo, which was just one of the pictures that we took that day, was going to turn into be such an iconic picture, and is one of the most well-known, worldwide well-known pictures of John Lennon today. But we took a lot of other pictures. It was a very comfortable day. I took this picture of him sitting on the wall that is one of my favorites. We used it for the cover of my new book. And a few weeks earlier, before I did this session, about a week or so earlier, John had called me one night and told me he saw a flying saucer. And he was very clear at the time. He was sober. He said that May had taken some pictures of it. And so it wasn't just John that saw it, May saw it also, and May never took any kind of drugs or anything. And so it was very believable. They wanted me to develop the film for them. And so I went over to the apartment and they told me the story, and John said he had just seen some lights reflecting, and he went outside and then he saw this big saucer-shaped thing with lights blinking around it, and it was floating by. And May ran inside and got the camera and took some pictures, and I had given her some film that worked extremely well in low light. And she had said she had taken some pictures of John in a recording studio with that. And I took the film home and I developed 2 rolls of my film and his roll right in between my 2 rolls. And my film came out fine, and his roll came out like blank. But like Twilight Zone blank, like absolutely blank. Like the pictures she had taken earlier in the recording studio weren't on the roll either. And it was very mysterious, very strange. And I went back with the film and I asked him if they'd called anybody, the newspapers or anything, to see if anybody else saw it, and John was like, well, I can't call the newspaper and say I'm John Lennon, and I saw a flying saucer. And I said, well, I'll call the paper, and I called up the New York Post, and they said, where did you see it? And I said, on the East Side. They said, oh yeah, a couple of people called, and I called the New York Police Department actually, and they had said a few people had called up on the East Side, and then I called the Daily News, and they had also said a few people reported seeing a flying saucer, and I called the New York Times, and they hung up on me. But anyway, the day that we were up on the roof taking the pictures around the rooftop there, John, at the end of the session, he pointed to where he saw the flying saucer, and he said, take a picture of me pointing to where I saw the flying saucer. And it's actually a little note on the album cover inside the Walls and Bridges album that he states that he saw the flying saucer there. But he was really cleaning up his act. Like I say, he was sober that night and sober most nights. He had brought the key musicians from Los Angeles back with him: Jesse Davis, Eddie Martok, Klaus Vorman, Jim Keltner, and Nicky Hopkins. And in the picture here was the engineer, Shelly Yakis. And he really seemed to be getting more serious and wanting to get the work done. And there was practically no drinking during the session. There might have been a beer or two afterwards. One night I came by and Elton John was there, and I remember John saying, where are you? I mean, where have you been? You should have been here taking pictures. And I said, well, as usual, nobody called me. Most of the time I would just stop by if I had time. But I did take a lot of pictures that night. John and Yoko were working on a song called Whatever Gets You Through the Night. And at the end of the session, I remember Elton asking John if he would sing the song with him when he played at Madison Square Garden. And John said, well, if it becomes a #1 hit, then I'll come to the Garden and sing it with you. But like I said, these sessions were much more clear. John was very hardworking. There were some drinking nights, but only occasionally. I remember one night, towards late October, we went out to dinner after the session with some record company people, and afterwards, John, myself, and Jesse Ed, John wanted to go out, and he said, come on, let's go downtown. And I had been telling him about all the bands that had been playing, New York Dolls and Blondie, and television was starting out, and it was the Club 82 in Max's Kansas City. And that weekend, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, the Dolls had played at Max's Kansas City, and everybody had been out, and everybody had been drinking, and it was a great time. And this was now Monday night in the rain, and John said, but this is my night to go out. So we went down to the Club 82, and we had had a few drinks at dinner, and I remember as we came in, John kind of missed his footing on the landing going downstairs and slid down the second half of the staircase and literally landed on his back. And there was a woman named Tommy who ran the club, and I turned to her and I said, Tommy, this is John Lennon. And although there were only about 3 people there when we got there, there was about 30 by the time we left half an hour later. People would always show up when John came around. Now I had an idea at the time to dramatize John's deportation hearing by taking some pictures of him out at the Statue of Liberty. And John liked the idea, and I came by and picked him up early one afternoon, and we just drove downtown to the Statue of Liberty ferry. And as I parked the car, John looked at all the big buildings down at downtown Manhattan, and he looked around and he said, you know, I bet I'm paying rent in every one of these buildings. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, we have so many lawyers working for us on different projects, I bet I'm paying rent in every one of these buildings. And he said that it was interesting that every time he hired a lawyer, they would go and meet the lawyer for the first time, and they would have a nice, respectable office, and then they would start working for John. And he said, when we come back 6 months later, they'll have an office that's 3 times the size, and his picture's on the wall. So I guess he was sensitive about paying for all those offices. But we took the boat out to Liberty Island, and as the boat came in, there was some high school girls getting off the boat, and they all gathered around John, all squealing for an autograph, and John just told them all to calm down. He would give them all autographs, and he did, and then everybody left us alone, and we pretty much went out there like any other tourist. We walked around in front of the statue, and the only hard part actually was composing the picture and trying to get the composition right of getting a normal-sized person in front of a giant-sized statue. But this has become actually my favorite picture because I think we actually didn't use it very much in the 70s. People didn't really write very much about the deportation case. I think they were afraid of the politics involved. But in the 80s and 90s, it took on a whole meaning of its own because I think a lot of people relate to John Lennon the similar way that they relate to the Statue of Liberty as a symbol of personal freedom. And Whatever Gets You Through the Night did become a #1 single before Thanksgiving Day, in fact. And on Thanksgiving Day 1974, John went to the Madison Square Garden and played the song on stage with Elton. It was a big surprise for the crowd. It was actually a big surprise for me. I only got the call about 4 in the afternoon to come down to the Garden. And the crowd went wild when they introduced John. Everybody was extremely excited to see him. Yoko was in the audience. She also was a friend of Elton's. And backstage, John and Yoko started talking together. While they had been separated, John and Yoko were in touch a lot on the telephone, sometimes 4, 5, 6 times a day. They'd be talking to each other. John had wanted to come home, but Yoko didn't feel he was ready until he really sobered up and got serious. But backstage they talked, and Yoko suggested he come by the Dakota, and a few days later he went to visit her at the Dakota and just stayed. He moved back home. Later, John said that some people separate because their marriage doesn't work out, but in his case, their separation didn't work out. Their first public appearance together after that was in February of '75. John was a presenter at the Grammy Awards here in New York, and many people seemed really pleased that John and Yoko were back together again, which I found really kind of interesting because before they broke up, in the sense, or before they separated, a lot of people thought that Yoko was terrible and a bad influence, and they just think that John should have been on his own and not with that, horrible, band breaker. And after they saw what John was like on his own and how out of control he got, I think that people were really very happy to see them back together again and to see their love story continuing and to see him settling down and being with her. Backstage, John was in a really good mood. He was wearing a pin made of diamonds that said Elvis Presley. He had a big gold badge around his neck that said Dr. Winston O'Boogie, which was his nickname, his kind of pseudonym. I remember when a makeup girl came into the dressing room and suggested she had to put the makeup on, and John sent her away and said, "No, I don't want any makeup." And she said, "But it's for TV, and you're going to look very pale." And he said, "Well, this is rock and roll, and the paler the better." But he was actually feeling pretty healthy. And by about a month later or so, a friend of mine, Francis Schoenberger from Bravo magazine in Germany, asked if I thought John might want to do an interview, and I called him up and suggested it to him, and he agreed to do it. And he came, I went and picked him up, and I picked Francis up, and I drove them up to Ontemayer Park, which is in Yonkers, just north of the Bronx. It's a very nice park. It's usually pretty deserted. It used to be a big old estate, and it's got really fancy formal gardens and a big cupola and a lot of different views, woods, and a big grassy area. And along the way, John did an interview with Francis, and he seemed to be in a really solid place. He had come to a lot of conclusions, I think, after sobering up from the LA experience. He put that very much behind him. And he was looking forward to a bit of a more conservative lifestyle. He had read David Niven's book called Bring on the Empty Horses. And David Niven was a guy who was a very dapper, distinguished kind of guy, but he hung out with all the wild people in Hollywood in the day and ended up writing the book about all those wild times. And John mentioned that that's what he wanted to do, that he was taking Polaroids of all the people that came to visit him, Mick Jagger and David Bowie, but he wanted to be the one who stayed home and didn't live such a wild life anymore, and he was going to survive and write the book. And he sounded really happy to be back home with Yoko, and he told us that day that Yoko was pregnant, and he was really looking forward to having the experience of having a child. We stopped for coffee on the way home, and I took this picture, which I always refer to as the working class hero. It shows a bit of a more serious side of John. I love the simple cup of coffee and the dollar on the bill there, and it just reminds me of a lot of times when we would just, could stop in for a cup of coffee at a place like that. In the fall of '75, on John's birthday, October 9th, Sean was born. And the same day, John found out that he won the deportation case and could stay in the United States. It was a really very positive, very happy time for him. A month later, he called me and asked me to come up to Dakota and take some pictures of the two of them with Sean. They wanted pictures to send to their family. He seemed extremely happy to be taking care of Sean. He was giving him the bottle and changing his diapers and really being quite the house husband and Mr. Mom, and really enjoying it. I think he felt very bad that he had missed the opportunity to spend time with Julian because he was always on the road with the Beatles. And he really wanted to make up for that and spend as much time as he could with Sean. A cousin of mine actually was a doctor at the hospital where Sean was born, and mentioned that John was one of the most attentive fathers of all the fathers that came there, that every 4 hours he was always there when it was time to feed Sean. He always wanted to be the one to hold him and didn't want him to be passed around by the other nurses and so on. And he was really very concerned about everything that happened to him. And I call this picture the Proud Papa. As you can see, he was a very happy, proud guy, and this isn't the kind of picture you can fake. It was a really great time for him. He felt very comfortable in the new neighborhood up on 72nd Street. He and Yoko would walk around a lot, or John would walk around alone. During the 70s, when he was raising Sean, he was learning also about how to take care of himself. Since high school, John had always had an entourage around him. He never had to do very much for himself. When he came back to Yoko, she suggested that he take a trip around the world by himself without even an assistant. And he took a little overnight bag, which is to change the underwear or something, and went out and got on a plane and flew to Hong Kong and eventually South Africa and then back to the United States. He told me that when we got together at one point, he told me that when he got to Hong Kong, he got into his hotel room and he called the room service for tea, and he realized he had never done that himself before. It was the first time he actually had ordered something from room service after spending years living in hotels. And when the tea came, he was drinking it, and he was looking out the window and watching the people outside, and he realized the tea in the cup was shaking, and he realized how nervous he was. But he went outside, he got on the ferry, and people didn't recognize him. And it was the first time in many years that he could walk around in the world and just be himself and not have people come up and react to him. And I think he enjoyed that somewhat in New York. He walked around, a lot of people, of course, would recognize him, but they didn't bother him. I mean, in New York, people are busy, and you might see somebody famous, but it doesn't mean that you're going to let them take your cab. You know, you might get home and tell somebody, "Hey, I saw somebody famous today," but you know, everybody in New York's busy. Now, during this time, John and Yoko got the flu at one point, and they were sick for a few days and not eating. And when they started feeling a little better, they decided to turn their 3 days of not eating into a 40-day fast. And Dick Gregory had been talking to them about a fruit diet and encouraging cleansing the body that way. And so they went on a liquid diet for 40 days. They ate nothing solid. And they got very clear. I visited a couple of times during that. It was like visiting somebody who's tripping. They really seemed to be very in touch with what was going on, very in touch with themselves and their thoughts. And John told me that most of his thoughts, of course, were about food. And but rather than just sit there and try to fight the urge to eat, he got himself a lot of books, cookbooks and books about nutrition and all kinds of books about food. And so he would sit there and read the books, particularly the cookbooks, and he would have huge fantasies about cooking enormous meals and then just turn the page and have another one and another one. And through that time, he actually learned a lot about cooking. And when they did break the fast, it was with some bread that John baked himself. And after that, he learned to cook a lot more. And when I met him, he didn't cook very much at all. Cooking for him was pouring milk on cornflakes. But he ended up, one time he made a really nice baked fish and steamed vegetables, and it was really good. And I think in January of around 76, John called me up and said that to come to the Plaza Hotel, they were finally settling their agreement with Alan Klein. This picture is when they're actually signing the paper. You can see how happy John is standing behind Alan there. The original agreement was 3 paragraphs on one piece of paper. It took 87 pages of paragraphs to break that agreement, and a lot of years of negotiation. So John was very happy about it. He wanted me to take a picture and announce it. Alan went out to Zabar's and bought a giant bread, because it was the hip expression back then about splitting the bread, meaning the money. And that's what this picture represents. But John and Yoko were very happy to be finally settling the serious business. They were finally free of any management. They weren't signed owing anything more to any record companies. And they really had time to take off for themselves without any commitments. And I think they really enjoyed that time. I had bought myself that year a 1954 Buick Special. There's a picture of Debbie Harry with my car when we were going to see the Ramones one time. And when we came out of the Plaza with John and Yoko, I told them I had my new car. A lot of times I would give them a ride home in my Volkswagen that I had previously. And John saw the car and he said, "Oh, should we all jump in the front like a teenage movie?" And I said, "Of course." And so we did. And I was driving him home and I told him that day the Bay City Rollers were coming to New York. I was doing a lot of work with them. It was the first day the Rollers, who had been compared to the Beatles because they had a lot of screaming teenage fans, and it was the first day they were going to be there, and they would love to meet John. And John said, well, if they still had a band together in 5 years, he'd meet him then. So I said, well, if he didn't have time to meet him, did he have advice for them? And he said, well, tell them to get all their money now in their own name, which they didn't, unfortunately. 120 million albums, they got nothing. In June of 76, John received his green card, and they finally had permission to stay in the United States, so that legal problem was over. I was very happy to be able to contribute a little bit that I took the picture on the green card, the ID picture. Yoko called me one night and asked if I had a suit, and I said, of course I did, and she invited me to come along when Merce Cunningham was having a debut of his dance up on Broadway in Times Square. It was a big achievement for Yoko's friend. Most of her friends were downtown artists who were unknown and kind of ostracized in the early 60s, and to be accepted up on Broadway was a big deal. Here's Yoko introducing Carly Simon and James Taylor to Merce Cunningham. We talked on the phone a lot during the time, but I was going out with a lot of punk bands, Clash, Sex Pistols, Patti Smith. And John and Yoko pretty much stayed home in the Dakota. As we traveled around, we did send postcards to each other once in a while. And this postcard actually was one that he sent me that I thought was very prophetic. John would cut things from magazines and glue them on the cards. And this is a picture of 2 dead people with the words "victims" on top of it. And on the back, it's hi from John and Yoko. The signature, as you can see, is 3 smiling faces with a happy sun. And at that time, a lot of people asked me, they kept saying, well, where's John Lennon? Why isn't he recording? What's he doing with it, just staying home? And I always thought of this card because he seemed to be in a really happy place, in a really nice place. And later, after he died, I realized how prophetic it was. But in summer of 1980, they did start working on a new album. They called me to come down to the Hit Factory studio and take some pictures of them. This was one of the first publicity pictures they had released in several years. It's in their, they had a private work study room at the Hit Factory studio. And again, they seemed very much in touch with each other. John had started writing some songs, and when he showed them to Yoko, Yoko was kind of writing response songs. And it's songs that shows kind of the responses between a couple in a relationship. And they're not simply statement and response, but they show the interaction of the feelings that come up between two people living together. And John was still involved very much with raising Sean. I think on their birthdays, Sean came to visit the studio, and John was showing him how the new computerized control board worked. A lot of people liked this picture, particularly John and Sean together in the studio. There's another version, actually, that Sean likes a little better, where he's got his hand on the control panel that looks like he's the one in charge. But John was very happy to be back at work. He's feeling very confident. I often stopped by late at night, and after they finished the mix, I would drive him home, and we would talk. And John and Yoko worked very much as a kind of almost like a tag team, where John would be producing and Yoko taking a break, or vice versa, Yoko producing while John took a break. A lot of people don't know the domestic side of Yoko, that she actually could knit very well. For John's birthday, she knit this tie for him, which was his school colors. And there's also a pin on the tie, which is an American flag made out of emeralds and rubies and diamonds. And when the album came out, Scott Muni played it on the radio. They were still in the studio mixing the rest of the album when the single came out. And Scott liked the record so much, he played it and then immediately played it a second time. And John and Yoko were so happy that people seemed to like the record. They started dancing around the studio. And they had picked a picture for the cover of the album that showed the two of them kissing. And the record company had initially objected to that. They felt that a lot of people were in love with John and wanted him to be available, even though he wasn't. Some people might object to seeing an interracial couple kissing. And John was so outraged by those feelings that he insisted that from then on, all their publicity pictures would be pictures of them kissing or being very close together. And the album came out to great reviews. It was doing very well. And the Village Voice was going to write a big story, and they called me to come and to show them some pictures. And I mentioned it to Yoko, and she said I should come up to the studio and take some new ones, because they were back in the studio recording a new single that she had just written called Walking on Thin Ice. John was very proud and happy that Yoko was finally getting some good reviews. People seemed to really like her material, and they were calling her material avant-garde and new and interesting. And he told me that they were relating to his music as more MOR, or middle of the road, and he was very happy about that, because he said, I'm going right down the middle of the road to the bank. So I took some pictures of them around the record plant studio here. The guitar in the background actually is something that John made for an exhibit when John and Yoko had an art show together at Syracuse University, and it was too big to bring home, and the record plant had a big freight elevator, so they had loaned it temporarily to the record plant where they had it on display. And I knew it was John, so I asked him to pose in front of it. And while we were taking the pictures, John kind of grabbed Yoko and pushed her up against the wall. And he said, take a picture like this. This is what everybody wants to see all the time. And I think he was right, because this is one of the most popular pictures I have. And John asked me to come back the next day and take some more pictures, because he had just gotten a new jacket. It was kind of a fancy jacket, and he wanted to wear it in the pictures. And when I got there, they were still working in the studio in the evening. There was kind of a glitch in the tape, and it took a few hours to fix whatever they were doing with the machines. And John and I sat on the floor for a while talking about the upcoming plans. He was very happy that the record was well received. There was a second half of the record. It was originally thought of as a double album, but they didn't have time to finish it. And he was going to finish the second half in January and have it out by February, called Milk and Honey. And then he wanted to make videos to promote the record. And by March, he was hoping to have a band together and start rehearsing. And in the early spring, he was going to go out on a world tour and go around the world. And we were really looking forward to it. That night we were talking about where we were going to go shopping in Tokyo and what we were going to eat in Paris, and it was a great plan. And when we left, it was dawn already. By the time we walked out of the studio, Yoko was tired, but John had brought his new coat and said, "Come on, let's take some pictures." And we took some more pictures on the sidewalk there. And I remember when John left, he said something about I had exclusive pictures of this jacket, and he said, "See you later." It was actually the last time I saw him. 2 days later, I was in my darkroom finishing the pictures I had taken that day, trying to make a 2 a.m. deadline that night. I was just finishing up when my doorman rang my buzzer and asked if I had a radio or TV on, and I said I didn't. And he told me he had just heard that John Lennon had been shot. And it was about the worst news I ever heard. My phone started ringing immediately. A friend called up and said he heard on the radio or on TV that John Lennon was dead. And I remember the word just resonating in my mind. I kind of sank down to the floor, and I was just thinking of how to change it, how to fix it. And death is the most permanent word we have. It's not negotiable. And I started realizing that the phone kept ringing, people were calling me up, and the whole world was watching, and everybody was going to be printing pictures of John, and it was important to get the pictures out that John liked. My job had been to make the pictures, and I had to keep doing my job. Yoko later referred to it as, when the guy with the flag goes down, somebody else has to pick it up, and you keep going, and you keep the cause going. And a few days later, they called and asked if I could have a picture for them to put up for a memorial in Central Park. And I chose this picture, the New York City picture, because John was very happy to live in New York City, and he really enjoyed his time here. And, I think of the Dakota and New York City not as the place where John Lennon died, but as the place where John Lennon lived. He was at a point of tremendous strength. After 5 years of introspection, I think he was very clear about his goals and responsibilities. As usual, he was way ahead of his time. He was taking great pride in parenting, working very hard to control his drinking and his drugs and eat a healthy diet. And those are all themes that have grown very popular, and I think he would have been a really great role model as usual. The world lost a great artist way too soon. But it's great that people are inspired by him and that his inspiration continues to grow. In 2000, I went to the opening of the John Lennon Museum in Tokyo. It's an amazing place. It's not just a collection of memorabilia, but kind of a path following John's life and work and explaining his desires to find and inspire others to seek creative freedom and peace and love. And actually, I had to go because the T-shirt I bought for $5 on the sidewalk in Times Square was now in a museum. Anyway, I'm very happy that I was able to put out a book. It tells a lot more stories than I was able to get to today. It's called John Lennon, The New York Years.
Ladies and gentlemen, Bob Gruen. Some sound here.
Hi.
Thank you very much. Bob, you've shown these photos, this slideshow before. It doesn't
Yes,
get
sir.
tired for you, does it?
No, because it's nice. It's really great things to remember. I always felt lucky to know John Lennon. I always felt honored. I always knew it was a very special privilege to be able to walk in and actually talk to him. As I got to know him and I knew him well and he could call me up on the phone, it never stopped being a real thrill to hear his voice. He was a very funny guy. He was very intelligent, and I always laughed a lot, and I always learned something. So.
Do you sometimes, from showing the pictures again and looking at them again when you're preparing for your books or for your slideshow, do you sometimes either get a memory that comes back that you hadn't thought before, or you learn something, some new perspective comes to you?
Oh, yes, because, life is long, and we did so many things that I'm always remembering little bits and pieces and favorite parts. That's why every time I tell the story, I actually remember different things when I'm looking at the pictures, so they're always a bit different.
One of the things from all the musicians you were working with at that time, and New York was such an incredibly vibrant scene, was John curious about that new music scene that was growing?
Good question. Actually, when John and Yoko first came to New York, they went out quite a bit. We walking around the City. He actually met David Peel just playing guitar in Central Park. I mean, what is it? Washington Square Park. And he went to Max's Kansas City. That's where he met the Elephant's Memory. He went down to the Fillmore East. But once he got over the drinking and crazy time and he started living with Sean, he canceled his subscription to Billboard. He told me that if he had the radio on at all, it was on the easy listening music station. I was out going wild in the punk wars, but he said he kind of had been there. In 1980, when he was coming back, I actually lent him a tape that Don Letts had made with the Clash and the Sex Pistols and the Slits and the Boomtown Rats, so he could catch up a little, because he really had dropped out. And I remember talking to him about the Mud Club one time and Max's, and he said, you know, I went to the Cavern Club, and what's the one in Hamburg? The
Astrid.
The Star Club.
Oh, Star Club,
Club. He said, I know what it's like in a rock club, and I don't have to go back. You know, it was kind of like when we were walking through Central Park one day and somebody saw John and he went, wow, John Lennon, when are you going to go back to, you know, reform the Beatles? And John said, well, when are you going to go back to high school? You know, he enjoyed it, it was fun, and you move on.
Indeed. Now I'm going to take a few questions in our limited time from the floor. I'm going to come down amongst you, and if you've got a question for Bob, I want that hand up. And who's got a question? Over here. Keep it snappy and loud and clear.
I was wondering why you were doing so much black and white in the beginning rather than color.
Oh, good question, a technical question. But yes, I did shoot a lot more black and white than color. Two reasons. One, most rock and roll magazines were printed in black and white. And it was only in the European and Japanese market that they would use any color at all. And the second is that a lot of the pictures that I was taking were in low light, natural light situation, where the color didn't really work very well. And with black and white film, I could get a much higher speed and it would work in the dark. And my style has always been to shoot a very natural kind of picture. I don't like to use a flash. And since I couldn't really sell them, I didn't really need color pictures. But thanks to the Japanese and the German magazines, I did always cover myself and shoot some color pictures, so I have them today.
Excellent. More questions, please. Hands up. Question over here. Let me run through. And where's your hand? Okay. Loud and clear.
What types of camera did you use?
Oh, I've had different cameras during my life. Early 70s, I got a Nikon. Around 75, I think I went to Japan and I got the Olympus system, which was a lot lighter and smaller and better electronics. And so I used Olympus most of the time until around 1990 when I switched to Canon, because their electronics are even better, the autofocus is better, and I'm using Canon cameras today. They're really great. They're the best ones. And I've switched to digital about 4 or 5 years ago. I started shooting mostly digital because all the magazines only want to scan. Even if you shoot film, you have to scan it, so I might as well just go directly to the scan. Although every once in a while, like the pictures that we did on the roof for the album cover, the portrait pictures, I used a Hasselblad that I also have.
Bob, when you were shooting and you come back with your contact sheets, did John and Yoko want to go through the contact sheets and mark them and so on?
Oh, yes, good question. When I first started talking to John and Yoko and they invited me to come to the studio, the deal was that they didn't pay me, but because I was getting access to them, I would have photos that I could sell to a lot of magazines, and so I would get paid by the magazines. And they would give me complete access so long as I always showed them the pictures that I took, and I only used the ones that they approved. And so, yes, I did always show them the pictures. Usually I'd make prints up of the ones I liked, and I was always right. They would pretty much approve the ones that I printed up. But they would sometimes want to go through the contacts and see everything themselves. Later in 1980, they actually had me make a print of every single picture so they didn't have to squint at the little contacts. And for a while I was making more money just printing the pictures, you know, rather than, you know, because I'd go and take 20 pictures one night, boom, I was selling 20 prints. So,
did you ever have any of those contact sheets like Marilyn Monroe with a big lipstick red
I do have
out?
one set, I think it's the New York City pictures that John actually put X's and zeros on. The X's meaning the ones he liked. I don't think there's too many crossed out.
Okay, more questions. We've got time. Okay, over here. Let me run through and loud and clear. Make way. Loud and clear in the mic.
During this period of time, John was such a private person and was so secluded. What was it about you that attracted him to let you come into his private life like this and take these type of photographs?
Oh, I don't know. I always felt very privileged to know John. I don't know. It's people have asked me before. I don't really understand like what qualities I have that other people like. You'll have to ask my friends. But I've had some pretty good friends. John Lennon knew my phone numbers. So did Joe Strummer, David Johansen. A lot of musicians that I get along with pretty well. I don't know. I'm able to be comfortable with people and just take them for what they are. And I think we had a similar sense of humor, a similar quick kind of wit, and cynical New York attitude.
Growing up, Bob, who were the photographers before, either in rock and roll photographers or even other photographers, who influenced you or whose work you particularly admired?
I was very influenced by Man Ray as far as art photography. Cartier-Bresson, also for art photography and for journalism, and Ouija, the photographer, always being in the right place at the right time.
Good. More questions?
I had a motto back then that I got from an advertising man called Stan Freberg, which was Ars Gratia Pecuniae, which means art for the sake of money.
Good Latin. Over a question here.
Yes, speaking of personality traits, where you got to see John in so many different moods, so many different beautiful photos that you took, what personality trait do you think John was most proud of in himself, and maybe what personality trait did you find he was most insecure?
Well, I can't speak for him, but those of us around him kind of admired his quick wit. He was very funny. He would just... very perceptive. He would see what was going on and turn it into a pun and be very funny. I think the quality people least liked was his quick temper. He could be kind of angry at times when things didn't go right. And like I say, he had a vocabulary like a Liverpool sailor.
Okay, we have a question over here.
Since all your pictures tell a story, and of course the New York City picture tells one of the most important stories, could you please tell me if the T-shirt is still part of the estate, or how did the museum
Yes, I gave that T-shirt to John, and he kept it. And the last time I saw it, it was in the museum in Tokyo. It is part of John's estate. Yeah, they own that. I assume they're keeping it.
Any other questions?
I still have about 4 or 5 of mine, though.
Hard to be, okay.
But it's covered with developer stains, and I used to think that was a bad thing. Now it's probably makes it more valuable.
Okay, come down here, and I've got a question over
Okay.
here. Someone here had a question. Over here, and then okay.
What do you think Yoko's best quality is? What do you think attracted John Lennon to Yoko?
Yoko is very perceptive, like John. Has a very good heart. If you listen to anything that Yoko's ever said, she's always talks about peace and love and about people getting along together, and I think that John shared that sentiment with her. And he liked her sense of humor. She has a very cynical, quirky, funny sense of humor. And unfortunately, being Japanese, she grew up in Japan. When you have your picture taken, you don't smile. It's kind of the opposite of America, where you're meant to smile. In Japan, they kind of feel that you should take life seriously and not look like you're just laughing, And so anytime you see a picture, a formal picture of Japanese people, they're not smiling. And so in most of the pictures, Yoko doesn't smile. But in real life, she's quite a funny person, quite a lot of fun to be with.
Question here.
She's also got a great figure. Even at 74.
On that. All right. I'm just curious if you ever did a photo with John near the World Trade Center.
What's the question?
Had you ever done a photo of John near the World Trade Center?
Of John and Yoko?
No, with John near the World Trade Center. Have you ever done that?
Pictures of John at the World Trade Center? No. We went down to the Statue of Liberty right past the Trade Center. I think that maybe in some movies they made in early '71 when they first got here before I met them. But no, we didn't go to the Trade Center.
John, Bob, the last question. A lot of people, I did an interview with Dick Cavett a couple of years ago when he put out the John and Yoko interviews he'd done. and he was talking about how profoundly that immigration struggle and that battle with the Nixon administration he felt it had really taken a toll on John. What were your observations about how harrowing that had been for John, bearing in mind that pressure? Because John was laughed at when he said he thought the FBI was snooping on him, and it turned out they really were.
At the time, when they first started saying that they thought they heard clicks on the phone, people were listening in, and you know, he was a pop star, a musician, and it didn't seem like the government of the United States was going to get that concerned about what a musician said. But you know, we had an expression back in the 60s that just because you're paranoid doesn't mean you're not being followed. You know, and it turned out, I mean, one night when I left the record plant, there was a car behind me, and to get to my house, you kind of have to go up and around and down and kind of through the village a little bit. And it was 4 o'clock in the morning. I noticed that this car was following me all the way. And once we got down to the little streets in the village, I was kind of getting scared. Like, why would somebody be going the exact same place I was going? And I pulled around the last corner and jumped out of my car, and their car pulled around the corner, and there was kind of 2 guys with fedoras. They looked like G-men. They really looked like the comic book G-men. And they looked at me and then sped away. And at the time, it was just totally mysterious. Like, I didn't understand at all why. And another time when I walked out of my studio and somebody in a car who looked like that also took a picture of me, and I almost didn't believe it happened. It was like, did I see that guy with the camera drive away? But later we heard about it, and that they really were following John and Yoko. And it is very scary when a government organization has you under surveillance, and it made them very paranoid. And I think it held him back a bit after that, because he found that if you speak out, even if it's just your own feelings, if people start listening to you like that, you can, you know, call the attention of the government on you. And I think it did hold him back a bit.
You know, well, when I was asked at one of those times with those sad anniversaries to sum up John Lennon, I thought the way I summed him up was saying that how amazing it was that John Lennon was the person that most frightened, the most powerful man in the world at that time. The President of the United States was frightened of John Lennon, because apparently the words and thoughts of John Lennon were frightening to a man like that. And that's what I think is an incredible thing. And here is the man who photographed John through all that time.
I should just point out that there's a movie that came out. There's a movie that came out about the whole deportation case called The U.S. versus John Lennon, with a lot of interviews with a lot of people that really explains that. It's a very good movie if you get a chance to see it.
We're actually
really
showing it tomorrow. We're showing it tomorrow here.
And there's a lot more stories that I wrote that are in my book, John Lennon, The New York Years. I'm going to be signing copies up in the Sapphire Room right now. It's in the lobby of the hotel out here. I'd be glad to see you. If you have any more questions or anything, I'll be out there for the next hour.
The great Bob Gruen!